Welcome back once again to the Kyle Style Podcast. I want to call this 9th episode Carl Sagan Flavored Kool-aid. So I'm trying to find a theme or a tone for this podcast overall, and so far I've just kind of been having fun, a little creepy pasta reading and maybe just read the news, that kind of thing, and give you my opinion. But I want to do something kind of like the last episode, the Sonny Bean Salish Feet one. But what I'm trying to do is draw a connection. So I wanted to do a podcast on both of these topics, and I found that I could kind of lump them together. So, Carl Sagan flavored Kool-aid, all right? So one of my favorite books that I like to recommend to people in terms of nonfiction is Carl Sagan's Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. And it's of broad scope as to the nature of science, scientific literacy and reasoning, critical thinking, and science education, specifically in America, right? But it's full of, that Carl Sagan kind of wonder and interest and an ability to raise, interesting and unique topics and concepts to kind of jumpstart people's fascination and to make scientific principles and theories more accessible. So I'll start off with a little reading from the opening chapter of Demon-Haunted World. And this came about after he had a conversation with a taxi driver or limo driver who was very interested in, what he thought of as scientific topics like Atlantis and, aliens and whatnot. And, Carl, I'm sure in a polite way, shot him down about that and, laid it down more clearly how, Atlantis doesn't have any evidence and there's no evidence for aliens really either. And he saw this person getting upset, getting sad that their pseudoscientific mysteries were being shot down. But they shouldn't be. And then this made him realize that there's a problem in our skepticism, our critical thinking, and our scientific literacy in America. So here's a couple paragraphs. I was going to do my Carl Sagan voice, but I've found that trying to do Carl Sagan makes me sound more like Walter Cronkite. Maybe if I did Walter Cronkite, it'd sound more like Sagan. But I'm just going to read it in my normal voice. So, science arouses a soaring sense of wonder, but so does pseudoscience. Sparse and poor popularizations of science abandon ecological niches that pseudoscience promptly fills. If it were widely understood that claims to knowledge require adequate evidence before they can be accepted, there would be no room for pseudoscience. But a kind of Gresham's law prevails in popular culture by which bad science drives out good. All over the world there are innumerous numbers of smart, even gifted people who harbor a passion for science, but that passion is unrequited. Surveys suggest that some 95% of Americans are scientifically illiterate. That's just the same fraction as those African Americans, almost all of them slaves, who were illiterate just before the Civil War, when severe penalties were in force for anyone who taught a slave to read. Of course, there's a degree of arbitrariness about any determination of illiteracy, whether it applies to language or to science. But anything like 95% illiteracy is extremely serious. So that kind of couches the approach or the perception there. And it relates to the other topic that I'm drawing a connection to. You may have already guessed. If you mention Kool-aid in any kind of serious nature. I discovered this second topic, I think I was probably maybe 13 or 14, probably at home alone, watching TV, and back before A&E, the Arts and Entertainment Channel did Duck Dynasty and other probably nonsensical fashion shows and reality shows and stuff. They actually had shows. It was sort of like journalism, and there was a show called The 20th Century with Mike Wallace. And Mike Wallace was a correspondent who'd been, he'd been in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. He'd been all over the place for half of the 20th century. And he hosted the show and narrated the show, and they did an episode on the, of course, I feel like most people know at least a little bit about Jonestown, Reverend Jim Jones, and the People's Temple. Thus, the Kool-aid, Carl Sagan flavored Kool-aid. At a young age, I was fascinated, not maybe a little bit morbidly with just the deaths and everything, but just the idea that people would follow their preacher, pastor, to a remote jungle somewhere and allow themselves to, and their children and their parents, their siblings, to all be poisoned to death. They would, at least many of them apparently willingly, went along with this, and all predicated on a belief that they were going, I guess, into God's hands, but that their suicide had a meaning and a message. And the people that they left behind, other family members who survived it or were not part of the church, they're as confused as anyone else. And this event occurred in 1978. And here we are, 37 years later. And I still find it fascinating. A lot of people find it fascinating. There's numerous documentaries and books about it. There's even conspiracy theories that have sprung up over time about this. CIA involvement and all that. And I wanted to also talk a little bit about how having studied about Jonestown and the circumstances that led up to its founding, its creation, and then the ultimate destruction, I found you might come across it if you're ever in any, questionable subreddits or web forums, links to what is known as the Jonestown Death Tape. Specifically is a piece of evidence. It's FBI evidence number Q as in Queen 042. And it's one of these recordings that I think if you listen to it, it would be like something, I could edit together something that almost sounds like this, right? And you would just go, oh, okay, I don't understand what's happening here. So I wanted to give a little background and, to kind of tell the story of the People's Temple. And in all that negativity, it's a very dark story, keep the Carl Sagan part alive, okay? Remember all the beautiful things Carl Sagan talks about in Cosmos. Remember some of that clip or that little selection I read earlier, and we'll dive into the Jonestown mass suicide, or was it a mass murder? So the People's Temple was formed in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the mid-1950s by a apparently charismatic young Jim Jones, right? And he had a different approach to preaching and to Christianity. He preached what he called apostolic socialism. So that would be sort of like being an apostle for socialism. And you could almost equate that to that kind of hippie Jesus idea, that Sermon on the Mount kind of approach. And to his credit, he insisted, remember 1950s, Indiana, he insisted that his church be integrated. and this was quite controversial. He wanted anyone and everyone to be welcome in his church. And he came from a troubled background, a broken family and everything, and you start to see these pieces fall into place when the story really starts to unfold, where he was maybe seeking attention, he really wanted a sense of power and control, right? But again, to his credit, he also he adopted children of other races. I think a Korean child, a black child. He had his own children, of course. But he, in a sense, practiced what he preached and gathered a following of, I guess you'd call them progressive-minded, white local people, as well as, other minorities who, were amazed at being kind of maybe welcomed into a white man's church. So after building a bit of a following, and fearing for an apocalypse, essentially a nuclear holocaust, right? And knowing that the nuclear strikes would probably be close to where they were, they looked at some, maps of where there would be theoretically safe regions in America, and one of those places is Redwood Valley, California. And they moved there in 1965. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to point out again, go back to episode 2 of the Kyle Style podcast, look at the cultural fallout episode, and there it is again, this exodus of followers of Jim Jones, it started as a result of fears of nuclear annihilation, nuclear war, and that theme of nuclear war stayed throughout his leadership, and that paranoia and that fear. So again, caught in the ripples of the nuclear arms race here. And so when they arrived in Redwood Valley, California, West Coast, a little more liberal, a little more progressive. It's 1965, that summer of love kind of vibe. And they grew even larger, even faster. Other more like-minded people joined them, and they built a community. They really had a lot of people doing a lot of work. They had a farm. They had buses, like a fleet of buses, and using those buses, they became politically active. And this led to Jim Jones becoming something of a celebrity in his time. He was this charismatic leader who was doing all this great work with the elderly and the minorities and, even addicts, helping get people off the street, that kind of thing. And allegedly, apparently, this really is true. He really did help a lot of people get off drugs and, find housing and become part of that community, which, again, to his credit. But, in the course of doing this, he became the head of the San Francisco Housing Authority, and he met with Vice President Walter Mondale. First Lady Rosalind Carter was known to meet with Governor Jerry Brown and Lieutenant Governor Mervyn Demali. I don't know who these people are, but, they're high up in government, at least in the state, and then meeting the First Lady, and an assemblyman named Willie Brown, among others, hosted a dinner in honor of Jim Jones in September of 1976. But as we know now, with a lot of cults, there's a downside, there's a dark side. So, especially with a lot of the elderly followers, a lot of times elderly black people who were susceptible to, that message of tolerance, I suppose, it kind of maybe pulled them in, and this sort of hope for a community that would not judge them for their race. He would have these elderly people sign over their homes, their Social Security money, to the church, and in exchange they had a seniors center for senior care, and kind of bring them into the church community and care for them while taking their financial assets. So it wasn't a complete rip-off, of course, but it's a little fishy when you start to get lots of money involved, right? Now, also around this time is when, at least I'm aware, that his sermons and his speeches would involve faith healings, and you'd touch people with his healing hands, and they would get up out of their wheelchairs, and everybody would rejoice, and they would all sing together sing his praises, that Jim Jones had magic powers, right? And even some of the followers later noticed that the people who he was healing were just people who were other members of the church, or that were employed by the church. They were secretaries and whatnot, and they were faking it. So a little callback to your Carl Sagan there, right? Be aware of shenanigans and shysters, right? If it sounds too good to be true, maybe it is. And he allegedly was curing people's cancer and all this stuff. So there were also allegations of sexual abuse, sexual misconduct with some of the young ladies. They also kept a lot of people working a lot, like 6 days, 7 days a week, round the clock, getting very little sleep. So this kind of eroded people's, ability to really process what was going on. So fall of 1973, newspaper articles were critical of Jim Jones and the People's Temple, and there were defectors that they had interviewed, defectors from the church, and this sparked urgency to Jim Jones to try to get a safe haven out of the country before this kind of publicity axe could fall. So, in 1976, after negotiating with the government of Guyana, which is, of course, on the north coast of South America, they negotiated with the Guyanese government and leased over 3,000 acres, like 12 square kilometers of land in northwest Guyana, basically jungle. The site was known to, it's very, very isolated. It was near an airstrip and one small town, but it had a very low fertility soil. Even the Guyanese didn't want to, cultivate there. So 500 members of the temple went down and began construction of the now famous Jonestown, officially known as the People's Temple Agricultural Project. And they built a village, and eventually Jim Jones went down himself and sort of shot a propaganda video, which I've seen at least clips of in documentaries and things, where he talks about the progress they're making and all the supplies and everything they have, and talks to the current members who are there and how they're getting on, and all of them seem very happy. They're very excited about the good work they're doing, and they're going to make a safe place for everyone else who wants to come. They're going to build this little socialist tolerance haven in the jungle, right? So, summer 1977, Jones and several hundred other temple members moved to Jonestown to escape, again, some of that media pressure that was building, right? And for the first several months, temple members, again, worked like 6 days a week from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. With a small break for lunch, right? Around the clock, heavy manual labor. And according to one documentary, which I'm gonna have to include a bunch of links at the bottom here. A bunch of links. One documentary indicated that at first, and this is based on some interviews with survivors, that they were having rice and beans and vegetables and chicken every day, every other day, that kind of thing. Everybody was eating well. Well, after more of these, other stateside members started to arrive, which was really families reuniting, because families had kind of split up. Some of them had gone, and they'd communicate via radio and whatnot. And this was now a big reuniting of families, right? So they kind of had to bring all these people. So now hundreds more people. Now over 1,000 people. And Jonestown was not self-sufficient. So at the arrival of all these extra people, it strained their food resources. It strained their, their housing and everything. And this is where it really starts to get out of control, right? Jones is implementing like these kind of Maoist, Soviet group behavior control techniques, having people sort of snitch on one another, sending out people to, suggest that they want to leave, and then if anyone else agrees, then they turn them in. Children encouraged to turn their parents in for saying anything negative about Jim Jones, who by this time they called him Father, right? They just called him Father, and all of everything that he had done for them, everything that it was good in their life was attributed to Jim Jones and his message and his love. And during this time, even other activists, right? Angela Davis and Huey Newton communicated via radio telephone and urged them to stay strong against the conspiracy against them, which Jones was always ranting about. And when I say ranting, there were speakers wired up through the compound, and Jones would get on the loudspeaker and preach and proselytize and rant about how the government was against them and multinational corporations were against them because they were socialists, and how there were the rest of America was racist, and they were going to start rounding up all the black people in America, and Jonestown was the only safe place for all the black congregation members, and really just pushed this conspiracy theory. And for the people who were there, they had no access to any radios or any other communications. So to them, they thought that this was real, that this was actually happening back home, right? That there was, nuclear strikes were imminent, and it was really that they needed to stay there. They were only safe there. Now, at the same time, Jones was noted to have kind of gone off the rails himself a little bit. Like, even the devout followers could tell that his speech was slurring and that he would trail off in the middle of sentences, that kind of thing. And he was alleged, I don't know how accurate this is, but he was alleged to be taking even cocaine, Valiums, Quaaludes, other stimulants, LSD, and barbiturates he was drinking. And this was all contributing to this mental and physical breakdown. It's kind of interesting how this kind of occurred. He was having rapid weight loss, convulsions, high blood pressure, strokes, and he was even having gout, swelling of his extremities. And you wonder what is causing that. Maybe it was these drugs, maybe it was stress, maybe he was just paranoid, maybe he had something else going on. But so again, because the village wasn't self-sufficient, they had to import a lot of commodities like wheat, okay? And even in that, there were people who still claimed to be happy there, right? They claimed to be happy. Now, the community also, had a nursery. They had 33 infants born. They had a clinic. There were doctors. In some ways, in some ways, people were really putting their best into it. They were putting their all into it, and they really believed in it. And it's part of the heartbreaking thing about it is that people doing their best to to make a world that they could all share and they could all live in. It's quite beautiful, but when you look at the actual context, it's terrifying. And you take into account things like the Guyanese government had agreed to kind of bookmark all the temple members when they arrived. So if they attempted to leave and whatnot, they could track them, right? They would prevent people's temple members from fleeing the country by canceling or overriding their visas and passports. So that's creepy as well. And after the arrival of Jim Jones in Jonestown, even some of the members noted that it became a much darker place, right? I mean, you've got speakers blaring either Jim Jones talking on it or tape recordings of him talking 24/7. And occasionally you would wake up to what was called a white night.
White night.
And
White night.
A white night
Come to the pavilion.
called everyone
Make your way to the
together.
pavilion. White night.
to the
White
central
night.
pavilion, a large public
White
space.
night.
And they would all do a dress rehearsal for the drinking of the Kool-aid. It was actually Flavor Aid brand fruit juice mix, not Kool-Aid, but Kool-Aid sticks. And they would, do a dress rehearsal for it and kind of prepping them for it, and also continuing to, deprive them of sleep and everything. So in light of all of this stuff, Congressman Leo Ryan of California was aware of it. There had been family members and defectors who had approached him, and there was these, media reports and everything. So he decided he was going to fly down there. On November 14th, 1978, he flew down with a delegation and some of the family members and defectors and a news crew. And they made their way to the jungle, to Jonestown. At first, they didn't want to let the family members or the news crew with them, just the congressman and his staff. And they toured Jonestown. They saw the sights and everything, and they had a party that night, and everybody was well fed, and this starts to get a little more complicated, and it's a little more specific than maybe I want to get. But he tells the crowd and Jim Jones, like, "Hey, I like what I see here. This isn't as bad as I was told it was, and you've kind of got a great thing going here," and there's applause from everybody. Well, the end result of this visit, though, was that Jim Jones kind of just went off the rails. He you can hear him in clips. He's saying, just leave us alone and just get out of here, and we don't want to go back, and no one here wants to go. Well, some people did want to go. Somebody slipped one of the news crew, who were eventually let in, and just slipped them a note saying, "Hey, here's my name, and I want to get out of Jonestown." Okay. And so the next day, this would have been, after a travel day and then an overnight stay. Now it's the morning of November 18th. Some, 14 people decided to defect and go with the congressman because they wanted to go home. And at least according to the Wikipedia article that has some info on this, while this was happening, someone, asked one of them, "Hey, why do you want to leave?" And he said, "This is a communist prison camp." To give you a sense. Well, they started to depart to go back to the airstrip. And during this transitional time, it was very emotional, and no one was sure quite what was going to happen. One of the temple followers, attacked the congressman with a knife. They were able to kind of fend him off and restrain him, but they were like, "All right, we need to get the hell out of Dodge, right? We need to get out of here." So everybody that had come, plus the 14 defectors, they all head back to the airstrip now. They needed to get another plane because now they had more people than they had thought that they had come with, so they get another plane there. In this time, Jones kind of gives the order for people to follow them down to this airstrip. While the people are getting in one plane and it begins taxiing down the runway, a truck with a trailer pulls up, and men inside pop up with, like AK-47s and rifles and start shooting all of the, defectors and the family members and the news crew and congressman and his people, and kill, many of them. Some of them were able to flee into the jungle and escape, but killed many of them, including the congressman. One of the only times that a congressman has been killed in office, by the way. And this is caught on video, and I'll try to include a link down there for the equally morbidly minded. Well, so meanwhile, one of the defectors that had joined them, other defectors knew was a loyalist to Jones, and they told the other defectors, and the congressman, this guy's not really trying to leave. This guy's suspicious, right? Well, as this plane was taxiing down the runway, he pulls out a gun, starts shooting the people in the plane. They disarm him, and some of the wounded people, they flee into the jungle, and we have some of their testimony now. They've done interviews and whatnot. Meanwhile, back at Jonestown is the kind of the beginning of what you call the Jonestown Death Tape. He calls a white night, gathers everybody to the pavilion. They bring out barrels, and they start mixing the drink with cyanide and Valium, chloral hydrate, and Phenergan. I'm sure these all had some use in this, toxic mixture. And you can hear in the tape, especially Jim Jones urging everybody, please hurry. There's nothing we can do. We all got to drink this poison. And the one member who you can hear on the tape speak up and protest what's happening was a woman named Christine Miller.
When we destroy ourselves, we're defeated. We let them, the enemy, defeat us.
Did you see I live to fight no more forever?
Yes, I saw that.
Did you not have some sense of pride and victory in that man? He would not subject himself to the will and whim of people who tell that they're going to come in whenever they please and push into our house, come when they please, take who they want to, talk to who they want to. Is that living? That's not living to me. That's not freedom. That's not the kind of freedom I sought.
But I think where they made their mistake is when they stopped to rest. If they had gone on, they would have made it. But they stopped to rest.
I'm talking about what we have no other road. I will take your call. We will put it to the Russians, and I can tell you the answer now because I'm a prophet. Call the Russians and tell them, see if they'll take us.
I said I'm afraid to die.
I don't think you are.
means.
I don't think you are.
But I look at our babies and I think they deserve to live.
I agree. But also they deserve, what's more, they deserve peace.
And she argues for the lives of the children, that maybe they can escape to Russia. And now Jones has told them about the killing of the congressman and everything. And so he just shoots it down, and she's shouted down by the mob, how dare you be disloyal to father, and
you would be no fucking good in Russia, goddammit!
You're only standing here because he was here in the first place. So I don't know what you're talking about, having an individual life. Your life has been extended to the day that you're standing there.
I'm not doing it justice, and I don't know if I should do it justice. It's kind of its own thing. Now that you know some of the context, if you feel so inclined, you can listen to the tape, and you'll really kind of get the severity of it. So 909 people lined up. They gave them the little kids. They gave them like syringes with the needle out so they could squirt it in their mouths.
And the older children can help love the little children and reassure them. Our crying from pain. It's just a little bitter tasting, but they're not crying out of any pain.
The adults drank, cups of it, and not everybody went willingly though. Some people were injected with it, like Christine Miller. Other people were shot, and I believe some people were shot with even crossbow, bolts, darts. But within, if you listen to that tape is about 45 minutes long. At the beginning you hear everybody, and by the end is just this silence except for a battery-powered tape player that's running down with one of Jones's previous sermons on it or lectures on it, and so it creates this haunting atmosphere. I guess the rest is history, 909 people went to the jungle to build a utopia, led astray by a megalomaniac, a drug-addled psychopath, an abuser, and it was the largest intentional loss of life until 9/11, of Americans until 9/11. So think about that, right? And there's, again, I'm going to include the links. There's a ton of documentaries. Some of them are really long. This is one of my longest podcasts so far, just trying to kind of cover it. And if you're, going back to the Carl Sagan thing, if you're interested in, rationality, you're interested in skepticism, listen to the Jonestown Death Tape, and you'll hear people arguing for stepping over to the other side, and they have no real idea that there's anything there. These two, a skeptic like me, and they're talking about poisoning their own children.
Die with respect, die with a degree of dignity. Lay down your life with dignity. Don't lay down with tears and agony. There's nothing to death. It's like Max said, it's just stepping over into another plane. Don't be this way. Stop this hysterics. This is not the way for people who are socialist, communists to die.
It's just, it's not about the total number of lives, more people die, from other things and everything, but it's so intentional, and they refer to it as an act of revolutionary suicide. You control how you die, right? And not letting the government stormtroopers that are going to descend on the compound torture and murder all the old people and babies, which is what he was telling the people was going to happen. And they believed him.
Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
Yeah, that kind of closes the story on Jonestown. But like I said, I wanted to keep that Carl Sagan awe kind of in there. We can prevent things like this from happening. You might be able to prevent it from happening to yourself, maybe to a loved one. Not even anything necessarily that severe or something that crazy, but we ride a fine line in our modern world. Everybody's got a smartphone, and everybody. A lot of people have gone to college and everything else, and a lot of times educated people are more at risk than other people. And you might find yourself in a Waco or a Jonestown under the thumb of a maniac. And I don't know, I think that there's not even anything to really say. The story is what it is. We're really removed from it now, but It makes me concerned when you think about the literacy levels and the awareness levels of especially a lot of young people today, and how we intend to proceed as a culture, as a species. So I don't know, do some reading, do some studying, enlighten yourself, empower yourself. Thanks for listening.